Today on the show, I'm lucky enough to have Tommy Castro on. His new album is A Bluesman Came to Town, A Blues Odyssey, and you just heard the title track. Tommy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It feels good to be back on tour, and during the time off that we had there, I was able to get this record done, and in time for us to come out on tour this fall. And at the moment, we're out on a double bill with Marsha Ball, so it's just been really, really pretty fun, and we're just all we just all found a new appreciation for the work that we do.
Absolutely. This is an album that tells a story, not necessarily your own, but a story of a musician from front to back. From catching the bug, as you hear in this song, to eventually finding his way back home. Tommy, tell me about when you caught the bug.
Oh, wow. So when I was a kid, my older brother, who's like 6 years older than me, was playing in rock and roll bands. He was the first guy to become interested in playing guitar and rock and roll music. I was just a little kid around the house, but my brother would be listening to the Beatles and the Stones, and eventually got in some cover bands in our hometown of San Jose. And I remember there was this time where they would rehearse at my mother's house and in the basement, and I just loved it. I don't know why, and I was just a little kid, but I would just want to hang around. Instead of running off with my friends playing games or whatever, I wanted to hang around the basement and listen to these guys play. And they'd chase me off every once in a while, but I'd always come back. And little by little, I started to become more interested in my brother's guitar, and eventually he figured out a way to get me to do chores for him in exchange for him showing me stuff on the guitar and letting me play his guitar. And so eventually I got my own and started hanging out with some friends my own age. But I think that was the first time I got the bug. And then as I was hanging out with kids my own age in the 60s, the FM radio was just starting to take off. Believe it or not, there was a time when it was everybody listened to AM radio, and FM was something like it was for elevator music or background music and that kind of thing. And there started to become rock and roll radio shows on FM, and they were wide open. They could play whatever they wanted. They weren't so corporate as they are now. And so there's all this great stuff coming across the FM radio in my town, and I would hear, Taj Mahal and Albert King, and or maybe somebody like Johnny Winter or the Rolling Stones, and I just became interested in that sound.
On the album, you also talk about the central character in the album and his decision to leave home, and how that was received by members of his family, how he wanted to do it. Can you tell me about your experience first taking off on your first tour?
Well, it's kind of complicated, my story, because when I was young, in my 20s, I wound up, I would do anything to be able to play music with other people. I just like to play music. And I remember a couple of my friends became interested in stuff like, outlaw country music. And so I had a little band that we were doing, we're doing like Eagles songs and, Willie Nelson tunes and then a couple of, there would always be a blues in there, because I'd been listening to blues since I started playing the guitar. So I'd always squeeze a few blues songs into that band. And then I wound up later on in some other kind of, a band that did sort of a miscellaneous bunch of oldies, old rock and roll songs. And there was a time when I was in a just straight up top 40 band where we had regular gigs playing whatever they played on the radio, you know. And so, and actually that, one of those bands became a, you know, sort of a band where you had to go on tour. It was a lot different than doing original music and going on tour and making records and doing what we do now. But there was work on the road doing that. And, I was just always, and then one day there was a blues club opened up in my hometown of San Jose, a straight up blues club. It was the first one since, you know, that I could remember that ever existed. And they had blues, started having blues 6 or 7 nights a week there. And I just hung out there all the time because that's what I really wanted to play. And, so I was doing miscellaneous day jobs and stuff, but I'd be at this blues club every chance I got. And then I was kind of the, house band for the jam session on Sunday afternoons, which led to a couple of local bands that I joined. And we were, you know, bona fide blues bands that were doing a combination of blues and soul and, you know, rock and roll music. And that took me to a point where I made a decision to become a professional musician, because the blues scene was starting to take off in the mid 80s, early 90s. And I moved to San Francisco where there were better opportunities, better bands and more clubs and more gigs. And I moved to San Francisco and started, playing with local groups. And so the point where I became the guy that was on the road, it was a long time. It took this process where I finally wanted to fast forward. I wound up in San Francisco. I joined a band called the Dynatones. It was a blue-eyed soul band that was making records on Rounder and Warner Brothers. And, I was just picked up as a sideman, as a guitar player and a sometimes singer, because they had a lead vocalist. And that was an education. I got on the road with those guys, and we would just travel all over the country in a van and, listening to, in those days there was no internet, and for entertainment, we would just listen to reels and reels and reels and reels of cassette tapes that the band leader, Walter Solwitz, otherwise known as Walter Shufflesworth, he was the drummer. And he would make these great mixtapes of his record collection, which was a massive record collection. He was touring around the country. He would just go to record stores and he collected all these old blues and greasy old soul recordings. And then he would make miscellaneous, mixtapes. And we'd listen to that stuff on the road. And I found out about all of these acts, all these artists, all of these songs and all of this music that I had never been exposed to before. Probably that was the first time I was really on the road with a blues act, doing something I really wanted to do, and got quite an education in the process. And that led me to starting the Tommy Castro band in the early 90s.
And it's worked out well for you, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I had a clear-cut plan, you know. It just one thing led to another, and I just kind of followed my bliss, you know. I went where things made sense or felt good to me, and you know, like joining the Dynatones seemed like was a great idea at the time, and little did I know it was going to set me up with everything I needed to go on and start my own band and start doing my own music, my own songs, and touring around the country and the world, and you know, playing alongside of and meeting and jamming with some of my heroes like B.B. King and you know, Elvin Bishop and Buddy Guy and John Lee Hooker and you know, the list goes on and on, all the things that have happened to me since then. And I never really dreamed that would be the case, and I didn't really have a plan to make all that happen. I just kind of did the next logical thing that was in front of me, and here I am, 30 years later. I
Yes.
can't believe I'm telling this story, and that only took me up to 30 years ago. Anyway, so we've had a band called either the Tommy Castro Band or now Tommy Castro and the Painkillers. One of those two things has been in existence for like 30 years now. It'll be next year. It'll be 30 years. So the Bluesman Came to town. Our latest record is something different than I've done before, and I always like to make a different record. I set out to make each record, have something quite a bit different than the last one. And I have to be honest with you, I was kind of running out of ideas before this one came up. And I really was like, what am I going to do now? I mean, and so did a conversation with a very close friend of mine, or just talking, and the idea of a blues opera came up. And I thought, a little bell went off in my head, said, wait a minute, that's a good idea. I don't think I've ever heard of one. And so I just kind of felt it out, talked to my record label and talked to my producer, and everybody seemed to think it was a good idea. And so we moved forward with it. And it turned out, I have to say, I think better than I expected.
So whenever I have a guest on this show, I let them choose a song to play, usually at the end of the interview. But for you, I think it makes sense to do it at the end of the first part of the interview. I'm going to ask you to choose a song that helped you catch that bug.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I'm just going to give you the first one that came to mind. It was Party Till the Cows Come Home by Elvin Bishop.
All right, let's party until the cows come home, and we will be right back with Tommy Castro on Country Pocket on WUSB.